what I'm going to go through here quickly is what is net zero? What does it look like in real life? Is clean energy really clean? Is it really just? We keep hearing about these terms, clean and just. What is the cost of net zero? We're preparing a study, will be published in a few weeks. You guys are getting kind of a preview of the findings of that study. We'll look at our two scenarios that we ran, the wind solar battery scenario and the lower cost decarbonization scenario. And then we'll conclude with push to balance environment and economics. So what is it that net zero is trying to accomplish? It's basically, as I'm sure many of you know, driven by Governor Whitmer's My Healthy Climate Plan, which commits the state to 100% economy-wide net zero carbon neutrality by 2050. It also, as many of you voted on this bill, Public Act 235 of 2023, requires that the state gets 60% of its electricity supply from, in quotes, renewable sources by 2035 and 100% clean sources by 2040. Now, it does allow in those clean sources the nuclear and also natural gas with carbon capture and storage. One aspect of that carbon capture and storage thing is that while across the planet there have been several CCS systems designed to achieve 90% carbon capture, none of them have actually done it yet. So on a consistent, ongoing basis, they have not accomplished that 90% carbon capture. So by 2040, if the system doesn't, or if that technology does not improve, we're going to have trouble meeting that goal. So what does net zero look like in reality? If you look to the people whose job it is to manage and maintain our grid, the Mid-Continent Independent System Operator, MISO for short, Todd Ramey, who's one of the senior vice presidents at MISO, testified before a federal House Energy Committee hearing about a year and a half ago, and he explained that controllable dispatchable resources, which by that he means coal, natural gas, and to some extent nuclear, are being retired and replaced primarily with weather-dependent, non-dispatchable and variable generation sources. By that he means primarily wind and solar. And those variable generation types we're doing that to achieve carbon reduction goals. But he goes on to add that weather-dependent generators are increasing reliability risks. We just heard Chair Wenzel explain one example of those risks. In our study, we also quoted several others. There's quotes from FERC commissioners, the Federal Energy Reliability Commission. There's quotes from NERC employees, the National Electric Reliability Corporation. They also explained those same sorts of shortages and problems. So another one, Todd Ramey's boss, John Baer, the CEO of MISO, explained in a publication that MISO put out early last year, where they said, Baer explained that the transition that's underway to get to a decarbonized end state is posing material adverse challenges to electric reliability. So we're hearing it from MISO, we're hearing it from other RTOs and ISOs, the grid operators, regional grid operators in PJM, we're hearing it in New England ISO, we're hearing it in ERCOT, the Southwest Power Pool, we're hearing several of them all say this exact same thing. And so we're seeing it also in real life start to play out. So last year we saw examples in the island of Oahu. They had a rolling blackout because there was insufficient solar and wind to supply the needs that they had. We saw just last year in ERCOT, which is Texas, do an emergency management order in January because they had more cold weather similar to what they had in February 2021. This time they were able to get through without a blackout. See the same thing in Alberta. This is the province of Alberta. During the real cold weather last year, they put out a note that said, look, we're having an emergency management situation. We also heard, as Rep. Wenzel just said, there was a power outage in Spain. They're not 100% sure yet, they're still investigating, but what it appears caused that outage was an extremely heavy reliance on solar with no grid or mechanical inertia to dampen swings in the frequencies. We just heard how the power went out for over 100,000 people in New Orleans for several hours about a week ago. And so all of these stories are building as we do more and more of the transition to decarbonize. But we're also hearing from academics and others that reliability risks aren't a fault of net zero, they're a feature of it. So we heard one academic from Rutgers University, David McDermott Hughes, who said that to save the climate, we're going to have to give up, as North Americans, our demand for a constant supply of electricity. And Hughes, in his article, said that we should actually model our grid, the North American grid, after Zimbabwe's grid, and after the post-Hurricane Maria Puerto Rico's grid, where the power went out. And he said that's a good thing. We should be willing to do that, because by abiding an interlude, load shedding, where we go through blackouts, then we're going to, solve the climate problem. Okay, we're also hearing from other groups like the American Council for an Energy Efficient Economy that we need to use wind and solar to decarbonize. But if we're going to do that, our businesses that expect to run 24/7, the companies that have 3 8-hour shifts, they're going to have to learn to accommodate the effects of weather when we do that. So those 3 8-hour shifts, well, we may not be able to do that. So what we should stop and think, what would that do to the productivity of our businesses and working, that sort of thing. And so I'll wrap up this little section here by asking or pointing out this quote from a book called The Unpopular Truth by Dr. Lars Chernow and Professor William Hayden Smith, where they said, electricity is to modern civilization what blood is to the human body. So when we start thinking about terms like, well, we should accept pauseful electricity, then, okay, put that in terms of this quote. Should we accept just not having blood in our body for a few hours? It seems nonsensical, right? Well, that electricity, that consistent supply of electricity is what we need to ensure our economy and our country really continues operating. So I'll move on to consider this idea that we're building clean energy. And I'll ask, when we are putting these sources in place, is this stuff really clean? And is it really just? And I know that you guys have heard from other groups and other, the utilities and that sort of thing, explain the challenges, the environmental impacts of using fossil fuels and nuclear and that sort of thing. So I'm not here to rehash that. You guys have already heard this. But what I want you to know is that there are environmental issues and social justice issues concerned with all forms of energy, not just fossil fuels. So I'll ask the question, when you see pictures like this, do you really believe that wind is protecting the environment when it's killing millions of large raptors and birds and tens of millions of insects and that sort of thing? When you see other academics producing papers like this, Vaclav Smil, who's an emeritus prof at the University of Manitoba in Winnipeg, went through and he looked at what does it take to get a wind turbine operating. And he went from mining and refining the minerals, getting the petroleum out of the ground to make the epoxies and the fiberglass and all that sort of stuff, manufacturing the wind turbines, transporting the wind turbines, building them, putting them up on site, and then operating them. And he showed that from every single aspect of operating a wind turbine requires fossil fuels. You cannot have wind turbines without fossil fuels in today's world. So he said, when he asked that question, what do I see when I see a wind turbine? Smil said, wind turbines are the pure embodiments of fossil fuels. So it's really not realistic to think that we're going to phase out fossil fuels by going to wind and solar. Some other questions. As we're using batteries and solar panels and that sort of thing, remember that the places that we're getting those solar panels when they're manufactured and all that, they have very different environmental regulations than we do. So this sort of thing could never happen in North America, but it happens every single day in China. So if you Google Baotou China, rare earth minerals, you will get pictures like this, where the refineries in China are legally allowed to dump toxic radioactive waste on the ground while they're refining those things in the purpose of producing solar panels and the batteries that we need for EVs and the magnets that we need for wind turbines and that sort of thing. Same sort of thing. If we're going to use these batteries that we want for EVs and utility scale storage, remember that using current technologies, the chemistries of the batteries that we're using require cobalt. Well, 60 to 70% of the world's supply of cobalt comes from the Democratic Republic of the Congo. And books like this, Cobalt Red, describe how a significant portion of that cobalt mineral comes from what are called artisanal mines that use 7-year-old kids to do the labor. So is that just? Is it equitable when we're using these sources? Even the New York Times admits and writes about the fact that in the Xinjiang region of China, solar companies use what's called forced labor, also known as slavery, with the Uyghur minority. So those are the solar panels that we're buying and installing in North America today. They're produced by slaves. So we have that aspect of the issue. The next aspect is what we look at in our publication that's coming out here in late June. We worked with a group called Always On Energy Research to do the modeling for this. And what they found is this bold portion in my text, that there is no inexpensive way to meet the CO2 emission reduction targets that Michigan officials have written into legislation. We cannot do it on the cheap. It will be expensive. And so what we did is we ran two scenarios. We looked at the initial requirements of the first versions of the 2023 energy bills, Senate Bill 271 and House Bill 4759, if I remember my numbers correctly. They required 100% carbon-free electricity by 2035, replace all carbon-emitting energy sources with wind, solar, and battery, basically, was what they wanted. That's what our modeling scenario looks at. It did maintain existing nuclear capacity, so we left that in our study. Our other scenario was the lower cost decarbonization scenario. We used carbon capture on existing coal plants, like the Monroe plant and the Campbell plant, and also the Blue Water Energy Center, which is natural gas, and the Zealand gas plant. So use carbon capture. And while those plants are living out their intended lives out to 2040 and beyond, we use that time to build nuclear plants, small modular nukes and APR 1400s, the big baseload plants. We also included limited battery storage in that, just to even up and make sure there was enough capacity. So why did we do multiple scenarios? Well, it deals with the uncertainty. We've passed bills like House Bill 235, and we still don't know exactly how that's going to come out on the ground. So we've got uncertainty, we're recognizing that, and then allowing for trade-offs and trying to enhance flexibility. What are the other options we can use? And then by doing that, we let people like you in this committee make better decisions on policy. So we're going from the electricity that we had in 2022, which was about 2/3 fossil, about 1/4 nuclear, and about 10 to 15% renewables. And then scenario one, we complete the timeline by 2035, we retire all CO2 emitting generation source, we build new capacity, primarily wind, solar, and battery. The costs for that, according to our modeling run, was going to be $360 billion through 2050. Again, there's no cheap way to do this. But the challenge or the punchline at the end of that slide is that there were multiple capacity shortfalls. So again, think New Orleans, think Spain, that I already talked about. At the end of our modeling run, this is what the scenario, the easiest and most economic, affordable way to make the wind, solar, and battery scenario work. It was 50% wind, 25% basically solar, and about 22% nuclear. That's a cost breakdown. Again, all of this will be in the report that's coming out soon. The majority of those costs were related to construction, taxes, and utility profits. This is the part that was most disturbing about our modeling run, which is if you look at the red spots, our model kicked out as much as 61 contiguous hours of capacity shortfalls and said people in Michigan could be sitting in the dark for as long as 61 hours continuously in January. So moving on to our second scenario, the low-cost decarbonization. This was our other option. Was there a different way to do net zero? So again, the timeline ends by 2040. We retire or retrofit existing CO2 emitting sources, and we replace them with like carbon capture on the big coal plants and the gas plants. We build new nuclear, small modular reactors, and APR 1400s. The cost for that was basically about half of the previous option, which is $206 billion. And there were no capacity shortfalls. So that's what it looks like. Again, mostly nuclear, about 20% fossil fuels with carbon capture, 80% approximately nuclear. And the reason that we did this, the short version of this slide, is that by extending the lives of existing plants, we reduce costs. We give time for the utilities to build the nuclear plants that we're recommending they build. That's the cost breakdown, and that's a much happier slide, which shows that there's no shortages, no blackouts associated with the second option, the low-cost decarbonization. For the average utility customer, there is also a big difference in costs because this, for the WSB option, essentially, on average, over the study period, everyone's bill would go up $230. For the LCD option, everyone's bill would go up about $125. At the end of that, they both essentially achieved the same thing in terms of carbon dioxide reduction. The WSB reduces by 57 million tons annually. The low-cost decarbonization is 55 million. At the end of that, we recognize that there's still no measurable impact on future global temperatures when Michigan goes to zero, essentially 0.0015 degrees Celsius changed. So wrapping up, the conclusion is we should choose to mitigate the damage done by net zero. We should choose the less expensive option that does not cause reliability issues. So consider the economic impacts, look to markets to develop better technologies, and then prioritize energy security. Any generation changes made by our utilities should maintain or improve the adequacy of our existing electric grid, not damage it, not take us toward the things that are happening in New Orleans, in Spain, in those other areas. And I'll close with this. I saw this comment on a Substack this weekend that a dark children's hospital is far more problematic than an operating coal-fired power station. So with that, I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you. Chair recognizes Representative Brixey.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Thank you for coming and giving us your presentation today. We're hearing a lot about choice this morning, and I'm definitely pro-choice and proud. I'm wondering, does the Mackinac Center think that energy companies should be allowed to make their own choices about what type of power they're generating and that they think is good to generate?
Yes, and part of the challenge that, like, I know where you're going with this, part of the challenge is that those companies are getting improper incentives in the form of the production tax credit, the investment tax credit. They're paid by the taxpayer to invest in energy choices that damage reliability, and raise prices. So the other aspect of these companies that you're talking about, the monopoly utilities that exist and operate in Michigan and around the country today, they're basically government-protected monopolies. Nobody is allowed to compete with them. So to some extent, recognizing that fact, it is your job to step in and say, okay, since nobody's allowed to compete with you and offer other options, then yeah, in the current system, the government has to step in and moderate or govern what they're doing.
Wait, so we should be involved in regulating and making the choices for the energy companies then? Is that what you're saying?
I would like to have a free, open, free market competition. But
We
that's
don't
not
have that anywhere.
right. You're making my point for me.
Well, but I thought the point that I get from your presentation is that you want SMRs and nuclear energy, which I agree is much cleaner than oil or coal. But and we've had tax credit requests for that type of
Right.
technology as well, and it's not really quite at the point of being there yet. So what I'm getting at is that the true cost of oil, think about the BP spill and think about the Valdez spill and the millions and millions of fish and beaches that were ruined and birds, all the pictures of the birds, the seabirds that were covered in oil and drowned and dead. It seems like if the energy companies are moving towards renewables, that's sort of their choice, and seems like they probably are not just factoring in that they're probably factoring in liability costs, because it's expensive when you have environmental contamination caused by something that everyone uses. It's very expensive.
Sure. So those costs are factored in, absolutely. But by the same token, what I said previously still applies, that through things like market disrupting subsidies and that sort of thing, and I would argue we should get rid of subsidies for any and all energy.
So you don't think we should be subsidizing SMRs?
No.
Okay, that's good to know.
Chair recognizes Representative Andrews.
Thank you, Chair. A brief setup question, which I promise isn't a gotcha question before I get to my point. So simple yes or no on this. Do you believe climate change is real? And the second yes or no question, do you believe it's a threat to humanity, civilization, anything like that?
So I've published a lot on this. Climate change is real. It is happening, sure. The next question, is it the existential threat that we've been told? Even the IPCC does not say that it's an existential threat, that it's going to end the human race, as AOC and others have said, that the world's going to end in 10 years. No, what the IPCC, if you read the science studies, say is that by 2100, if the absolute worst case scenarios, RCP 8.5 as an example, happen, and we stopped all climate mitigation, and just instead of doing any sort of clean energy efficiency, anything like that, we shut it all down and increased around the world our use of coal by 500, 700%. Then in that instance, the impacts would be things like, instead of having, I believe the number's 250% GDP growth by the year 2100, we would have about 247% GDP growth by the year 2100. So yes, it'll have an impact. Yes, it would be in some ways negative, but at the same time, it's not like a comet hitting the planet.
I don't disagree that it's as bad as a comet hitting the Earth, but I do think that the impacts we're seeing right now are already showing a potentially very severe impact on the way we are used to existing, at the very least. I'm not saying civilization is going to be wiped out, but very difficult to enjoy the standards of living that we have if things continue as they are. The reason I asked that question as a setup is because it's very hard for us to find common ground on why it's important to shift in this direction if we don't agree that climate change is a reality and that the impacts are going to be severe. And I want to say that I agree with elements of what you're talking about here as far as cost being very important. I've said for a long time we can't fight climate change if we put too much of a cost burden or there's rolling blackouts on society, because unfortunately we're not the society we used to be that's willing to bear burdens for a greater good. And so we have to make sure that impacts are light. But I think there is a middle ground, and I'm curious what you think about this, between your two proposals up there, one that keeps coal plants active and the one that is just purely solar, wind, and batteries. And I think our climate plan actually points to this middle ground a little bit here, because obviously solar has become the cheapest form of deployable electricity. I mean, there's a reason that Texas is building solar faster than they can produce it. But also, to your point, we need base load electricity. We need dispatchable electricity, something that nuclear is very good at. As you point out in your second scenario, SMRs, nuclear power. And we have gas with carbon capture, even if it doesn't quite get to 90%, as a good dispatchable option to help kind of bridge us into a nuclear, wind, solar sort of mix, maybe with some limited gas capacity left. But I think, and I don't see the reason why we would want to keep coal capacity. I understand that coal has been historically cheap, but we've also tapped out a good deal of the cheap coal that's accessible. And exposure to coal in the power plants is, one, more radioactive than a nuclear plant, which is a fun fact I always like to share. If cook in Palisades, and we always like to tell our communities, your exposure to radiation is less than if you live next to a coal plant. The health impacts from coal are just remarkably bad. The mining, all of it is just really bad. And so I just interested in why you don't see a middle ground between these two, where we continue to build out solar and wind while maintaining dispatchable gas for at least a period of time and building out the nuclear baseload, because I think that points us in a direction where we're eliminating a lot of the highest health risk and most climate impactful generation while still maintaining grid reliability and low cost.
Okay, I'll try. There's a lot there. So
I appreciate that.
I'll try to boil it down. You're concerned about climate change, correct? Yeah. Okay, so if I go back to these slides and say both scenarios achieve your end, don't they? They both go to net zero, essentially. One a little bit less, but effectively very similar. Okay, now the other one doesn't, it's not going to work here, doesn't do that. Now, I understand where this is why we modeled two different scenarios. Like I said, we have flexibility, we can do something in between. But the reality is, you brought up Texas as an example. Texas is building a lot of wind and solar. Just as I said in the previous question, they're doing that because the incentives are wrong. The federal subsidies for wind and solar are quite large. Texas, in the past few years, has had its price increase, electricity prices go up by something in the neighborhood of 28%. The more we use the unreliable and non-dispatchable, weather-dependent sources, the more we're going to see imposed costs. Because what you end up having to do, and this, I didn't have time in this presentation to go through the whole paper, but we go through and show how the levelized cost of wind and solar are much higher once you include the reality that you have to overbuild and then curtail wind and solar in order to meet basic reliability requirements. So you have to do that in order to make wind and solar work. You have to build a lot more. And then on a warm, like 70-degree sunny day, when the wind's blowing, they overproduce. That's why California has what's called the duck curve, because they overproduce and their net demand once you minus out what solar needs, goes below the demand curve. And during the day, California is scrambling to get rid of the extra electricity that their solar produces. So they're having reliability problems, having to deal with that, because just the inherent nature of wind and solar does not fit well with the way our system is built. So the issues, again, I'll keep going back to other slides here. What are the challenges that we're facing? Blackouts, unreliability. These are happening in systems that are exactly as you described. So Spain's system was about 70%, 60-ish% solar, 12-ish% wind, with small little bits of spinning reserve natural gas and nuclear. And because of what appears to be a lack of mechanical inertia, their system crashed and took the entire Iberian Peninsula out. So part of your question was, how can we continue to have the society that we're accustomed to and still address these challenges? Okay, that slide right there shows we do not have the society that we're accustomed to. When our system can go up and down like that, that's problematic. When we have groups saying things like this, well, business may not be able to run 3 8-hour shifts. What does that do to the people who work in those plants? Eventually, they're going to get laid off because you can't run three 8-hour shifts in a row. Okay, so again, back to your question, we're not designing a system that works with the society that we've grown accustomed to. We need to do something different, which is why at the end of my presentation, I say we need to focus on reliability and affordability. We have the technology when we're doing that to make it very clean. That's why, again, go back to another slide here. When you look at emission issues, we're doing it with the LCD scenario. We're using carbon capture to address the climate concerns. Now, carbon capture is more expensive and all that sort of thing, I understand. But that Public Act 235 was passed. It's law. So we have to achieve this somehow. Do we want to do it with reliable, affordable electricity or not?
Thank you, Jason. So to wrap it up real quick, we've got one last question, a quick question from Rep. Preston.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Jason, for being here today. Just a quick question. Did you check out the summer planning resource auction and the advent of the new reliability-based demand curve? And what did you see regarding the 50% decrease in surplus capacity in the northern regions?
Yeah, so MISO's summer reserve capacity auction last year, it was $30 per megawatt day. This year, it's $666 per megawatt day. So what is that, about a 2,000% increase? Okay, that's showing, and MISO said this in their slides that explained the results of the auction, that's telling us we need to build reliable capacity now. They didn't mince words about it. A 2,000% increase in the prices that people around the region are going to pay because the utilities have to bid in and pay that cost. That's a significant increase. So for the average, think whatever it is, a rural citizen in one of your that you represent in your district, do they have that kind of money? They're going to be able to spend an extra $200-300 a month to be able to provide electricity for their house and to keep their family warm, to cook their food. The single mom in inner city Detroit, does she have that money to pay those extra bills? And I know we have things like MEAP and LIHEAP and that sort of thing. Okay, so if it's not the single mom in Detroit, then it's the stressed out soccer mom and dad who are trying to get their kids that are middle class and are able to pay their bills. Well, now they're paying more on top of their bills to cover the other costs. So yeah, it's a serious issue and it should be addressed.
Thank you, and thank you for being here today.